And our first question comes from committee member Kieran Howard.
Hi. Yeah, I've got a few questions. Thank you for your talk, very informative. I'll just throw a few questions at you. Okay. What is the role of the Chinese media in stereotyping Uyghurs, portraying the violence in Xinjiang province as a fight between righteous Han Chinese and machete-wielding Uyghur Muslim extremists, and the use of 9/11 to blame Uyghurs and stereotype them as terrorists, separatists and extremists as enemy number one? And recently the Chinese Ministry of Public Security has condemned this organisation called ETIM, which is the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, as a terrorist organisation. It's also known as apparently as the Turkestan Islamic Party. However, Drew C. Gladney, an authority on the Uyghurs, an American authority on the Uyghurs, argues that there is a credibility gap about this group, since the majority of information on ETIM can be traced back to Chinese sources, with the existence of ETIM as part of a US-China quid pro quo, where China supports the US war on terror in exchange for US condemnation of ETIM as a terrorist organisation, whether it even exists. The Uyghur American Association has publicly doubted ETIM's existence. And do you feel that the Chinese policy of mistreatment and discrimination against the Uyghur people and the loss of their lands, etc., and the destruction of their culture and religion may lead to a radicalisation of Uyghur youth and proliferation of actual terrorism, where life will imitate propaganda? Fiction.
Yes, thank you. Well, on the first part, the role of the Chinese media is of course essential in framing the Uyghur people as an enemy of the Chinese state and the community and harmony and prosperity of the greater People's Republic. Media control and repression under Xi Jinping generally in China, as you know, has achieved new peaks. In a tour of a Chinese state-owned TV station, CCTV, I think it was last year, Xi Jinping said that all journalists, all editors, all people working in the media in China must love the party, must study the party, must adopt the party as your family name. So he was making it extremely clear that there is no latitude for media freedom in China, and that you are expected, and in fact it's enforced, that you will carry out exactly government policy, and the treatment of so-called splitists, whether it's Tibet or Xinjiang, is one of their strictest areas of control. So the Chinese media has no liberty in the way they want to portray this problem, and therefore the uniformity of the portrayal obviously serves the Chinese Communist Party's agenda very well and serves the repression. And on your last part, could this sort of over repression produce a terrorist backlash in response? Well, if you push any people far enough, you'll get a backlash. But the scale and the severity of this repression, if in fact towns and districts are being given quotas of locking up, and this is after only 2 years of this new internment policy, 40% of the population, it suggests that there will be no latitude, no opportunity for a lashback of any sort. People under 40 are another priority target, by the way, for this internment policy. So if they're all locked up, I don't know who's going to throw the first Molotov cocktail.
So ETIM doesn't exist?
The detail on the existence and nature of ETIM, I don't know, and I'm certainly no expert on this subject, so I just can't help you on that one.
Thank you for your talk. This is a question that out of innocence and ignorance on this issue, so it's for my edification. What is the persecution of the Uyghurs? Is it something in China, in terms of Chinese history, is it something peculiar to the communist regime? Was there any element of persecution under previous Chinese dynasties? And I guess flowing on from that, so what have the Uyghurs, if it's something new, what have the Uyghurs done or not done to earn the enmity and displeasure of the communist Chinese? Thank you.
Well, I hasten to add once more that I'm not an authority on this subject by any means. You know, there's an old saying about journalists, we know the first two lines of every song. In my case, I only know the first line and often get it wrong, but so there have been, under Imperial China, there were successful attempts to contain, to dominate the Uyghur people and the province the area that's now known as Xinjiang. But it's, from my understanding, and there may be other people in the room who know more of the history, and if so, please do jump in and please correct me, but the extent of Chinese control has ebbed and flowed with China's state power, and as the Imperial China fell, so did its influence on its periphery. Now, of course, China is greater than it's been since the Industrial Revolution. Its influence is spreading and it's consolidating power on its periphery in Tibet and Xinjiang, but also, as we know, in the South China Sea, among ASEAN states, and using a range of different means in different parts of the Chinese ever-enlarging sphere of influence. What have the Uyghurs done to earn particular enmity of the Chinese Communist Party? Well, until September 11, apart from being different, apart from being a minority on the border of the Chinese sphere of influence, nothing. After September 11, nothing in particular. After September 11, 2001, that they earned the label terrorist, courtesy of the Chinese Communist Party. 2009 was the uprising, which produced a severe crackdown from Beijing, and now the most recent phase. The most recent phase since 2016, when Chen took control as party secretary, as far as I know, hasn't had any particular galvanizing trigger. There's no particular reason. It was simply time to finish the job of consolidating control of this troublesome province.
Okay, I'd like to just answer the last two speakers' questions. So I'd like to do that. Firstly, there is the group called Turkestan Islamic Party. It's a real group. It has engaged in terrorism, and one of its objectives is opposition to Chinese government is that it offers equal education for women and men. So which is one of its grievances against the Chinese government. And secondly, the TIP has been engaging in terrorism in Syria. So it is well known for its demolition of Syrian Christian churches, and it's under the leadership of the Turkish-led brigades. And so yeah, it is a very real terrorist group that was founded in the 1980s at the height of the Soviet-Afghan War. And yeah, secondly, as for the Uyghur province, the province of Xinjiang didn't exist until the 19th century when it was created by the Manchu emperors. And before that, southern Xinjiang, which is Tarim Basin, is an Uyghur stronghold, while northern Xinjiang, which is Hungaria, was inhabited by a different group of people called the Zungars, which they're Mongol Buddhist people, which the Manchu emperors waged a war against. So when you look at this way, the capital of Xinjiang, Urumqi, was never under Uyghur control, despite what some Uyghur nationalists say. And lastly, I want to point out that Miss Kadeer herself is not quite so innocent, because she has friends among the her friends and supporters amongst the international stage include Japanese nationalists who are extreme right-wing and anti-China for obvious different reasons. And secondly, during the 2009 riots, the Western media it also did a terrible job of describing the conflict. So, for example, there were violence against Chinese civilians, and yet they were quite downplayed. So you have situations of voters being misused, of Han Chinese victims being used to describe being told that they were Uyghur victims, which is completely not true. And I find this self-fulfilling prophecy. So you have such a, as you described it, such a degree of censorship in Xinjiang that the only sources you can get either from the Chinese Department of Propaganda or Uyghur dissidents, both of which have cases ground against each other. So there is a need for a more greater independent investigation into the conflict. Thank you.
Can I just add on to your last comment that a lot of journalists would love to spend time in Xinjiang and do a thorough job of reporting developments there, but access to the outside world is strictly controlled. Foreign journalists, when they are allowed in, are interviewed as they emerge from the aeroplane by local security officials who may choose to travel with them for every minute of their time. Their access to local people is controlled. In other words, it's impossible for independent international reporting to occur. But I think everybody would welcome some accurate information. I don't think we're going to get it.
Yeah, John Hallam, I'm with People for Nuclear Disarmament. I wondered if you might like to sort of go through the mental exercise of putting the repression of the Uyghurs in the context of the Belt and Road, and in turn putting that in the context of China's history going back to the Han Dynasty, when China controlled everything up to the Caspian Sea and the Roman Empire went bankrupt.
Well, inviting me to do a mental exercise sounds like hard work, but obviously Rebiya Kadeer's, one of her points was that the initial phase of the Chinese assertion of domination was conducted through infrastructure, through building roads.
That's basically what I asked.
Yeah, and we have the same story being told by the Dalai Lama and the people of Tibet, the leaders of the government in exile of Tibet, telling us the same story, that when the Chinese first built the first roads, they were very welcome. They were very well-behaved visitors and developers, but that Sangay Lobsang is the elected Prime Minister of the government in exile of the Tibetan people, and he says the quote he gave was, first, when the road was built, first came the trucks, then came the troops, then came the tanks, and now we have no freedom. When he made that comment, that was at the Canberra National Press Club last year, I stood up and said, well, and he joined the dots exactly the way that you were inviting me to do, by saying that this is Belt and Road, we were the prototype, and now it's being extended throughout the world. So I said to him, you know, this is a very troubling picture that you paint, but why must it be so? We, for example, here in Australia, in the 1980s, we had this terrible panic went around that the Japanese were taking over because they were buying all our real estate, buying control of all these assets. Australian investors couldn't compete, and we were about to be crushed. In the end, of course, the Japanese economy rather, hit the wall. All the investment was retracted, and large amounts of money left in the pockets of Australian investors who'd sold to the Japanese in the first place. So why must it necessarily be a picture of conquest and permanent dominance? Could be just another phase. And when the Chinese economy has its big crunch, which hasn't yet happened, yet of course is inevitable, simply because it's a capitalist economy built on a lot of debt, and it's like night follows day, there will be a reckoning. Why would we not suffer that fate of just another phase, another fear, another unfounded panic? And his response was that this time it's different because while the Japanese were driven by, so this is the Tibetan Prime Minister of the government in exile, he said that the Japanese were driven by a demand to get their money offshore, to expand their commercial empires and to get more profit and more return and more cash than they knew what to do with, obviously, and no sense when it came to investment. The Chinese, he said, are different because they have a mindset of racial superiority. They see themselves as the Middle Kingdom, and it's their historic destiny to establish domination over everybody else. Much of the Chinese investment wave at the moment is not commercially driven, but is strategically driven by state-owned enterprises getting a foothold on assets which may be of use to the future needs of the Chinese population, particularly in agriculture and mining sectors, and that we shouldn't expect, even if there were a Chinese correction, there to be an outflow of the Chinese capital, because so much of it is strategically based. So that's his take on it. However, I would just add, because Belt and Road is such a large, interesting and many-faceted project, that we have so far, formally 68 countries have signed up to Belt and Road funding from the Chinese Communist Party. There are already some of those have ended badly. The port of Hambantota in Pakistan being, Sri Lanka being the leading example, where it was a $6 billion debt that had to be serviced by the Sri Lankans. They were unable to service the debt to pay for the port, in return for which the Chinese government said, well, that's okay, we'll just take a 99-year lease and operate the port for 99 years, and we'll take control, but that's cool. So this is what's led a lot of people around the world, including our very own foreign minister, to say that countries need to be careful of Belt and Road, that it doesn't compromise their sovereignty. We see in Malaysia, as another example, just since the election or re-election of Mahathir, in Malaysia, the Belt and Road projects are now being reconsidered and cancelled. One of Mahathir's election platform or election themes was to say we have lost control of our sovereignty, meaning to Chinese investors, and that I will, if elected, I will correct that. And he has immediately set about trying to renegotiate, cut, or otherwise amend projects, including there were reports just today about one of the rail projects where Mahathir's government has ordered construction work to halt. So Belt and Road, in its different manifestations, is hitting different resistance points and problem points, and so its evolution is a fascinating, a daily and very variegated experience.
Oh, thanks very much, Peter, for the talk. Just a couple of general points. I mean, I don't want to launch a whole new discussion here, but very quick in history, we had the Chinese Revolution. They saw, after a whole lot of developments under the Maoist regime, they saw the way things were going in the Soviet Union, and they decided after Tiananmen, if you can't beat them, join them. So they've gone down the capitalist road. And they have a very unique system called state capitalism, which I would call state capitalism with Chinese communist characteristics. It's a unique system within the capitalist world. Second point, I give total support to the right of self-determination for minorities within the Chinese former empire, which, like the Soviet Union, incorporated those minorities. The Uyghurs are one of them, the Tibetans are another. So they have the right to self-determination. But my point is slightly shifting the discussion. I thought you might like to comment on this. In Australia, I think the recent discussion has elements, although there's an element of truth in it, but there's an element of the yellow peril and the red peril in our attitude to China at the moment.
I think it's come down from a long period. I have to ask the question, we look at Chinese investment, my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that British and US investment is still by far the highest foreign investment in Australia by massive amounts, including in property, including ownership of agricultural land and all the things that we're supposed to be terrified about. So I think there is an element here we have to be very careful in this sort of fear campaign that's going about China's taking over Australia, to be aware that it has historical roots in the yellow peril, the red peril, and be very careful in our analysis of what is really going on here. After all, there's no Chinese bases in Australia, there's US bases dotted all over the place, including in troops in Darwin. We had a discussion last week about that. Right. So, anyway, I won't give a huge speech, but I thought you might like to comment on this, to me, a cognitive dissonance here about this great threat from the north, from China, whereas if we are a colony of anyone, it's still the United States. Heaven forbid, Donald Trump. Okay, if you'd like to comment, thank you.
Australia has always been troubled by foreign investment, and it's long been troubled by imaginings of Asian hordes, of course. The reason we have a Foreign Investment Review Board, which was founded in the 1950s, was because of a wave of panic at that time that Australia was being swamped with American investment. That's why the FIRB was set up. To this day, as you say, if you don't look at the flow, look at the stock of foreign investment in Australia, yeah, the US is by far the dominant owner of assets and land, followed by the Brits, the Japanese, even the Danish, I think in stock have more.
That's that ice cream place.
Is it the Netherlands? Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it's that ice cream store.
So in terms of that ice cream, those franchises are in pretty valuable pieces of real estate. So you're right. I mean, perspective is a difficult thing. But Chinese investment is big in current flow rather than stock. And even the current flow has pegged way back since last year when Beijing imposed controls on capital outflows and discouraged, in fact issued an edict preventing Chinese companies from investing in certain asset classes that would get too much attention or were too speculative. Hence we see Wonder, the huge Chinese development company, selling its Circular Quay 1 project for $1 billion just a few months ago. So we have a historic fear of foreign investment, and we have a historic fear of imminent Asian swamping. Now, that of course is pretty overdone. However, it's not entirely without basis in reality, because the Japanese did actually try to invade, of course, as we know. So there is some basis to it. The Chinese are not mounting a military invasion.
Not yet.
Who knows the future? I mean, we know that. So the fundamental change in China grand strategy was, as you know, Deng Xiaoping famously said that China's grand strategy was to hide your light, bide your time. The big change came in 2013 when Xi Jinping replaced that with strive to achieve. Since then, we see China in strive to achieve mode. In other words, we've been patient, we've built economic strength, we've got the resources, we can now get ahead with consolidating the power and the resources that we want to assert and the return to our historic position. And overcoming the, quote, century of humiliation, unquote. The first cabinet meeting that Xi Jinping held, once he became president, he took his entire cabinet down to the National Museum in Tiananmen Square and led his cabinet in person through an exhibition on China's century of humiliation. I mean, this is a very clear statement of China's return to greatness and what Xi Jinping calls the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. And who could blame them? Who could blame them for wanting that? from being by far the dominant economy in the world until about 1840, when the Industrial Revolution powered the Europeans to overtake them. So who could blame them? They're people who study very closely, much more than me, current Chinese debates and thinking in the leadership and in the think tanks that surround and serve the leadership about China's strategic purpose and where it intends to go next, say that the Chinese authorities, the Chinese Communist Party at its highest level, hasn't decided yet what to do with the wealth and power that it is now amassing day by day. They don't know what the end point of this is. So it seems to me to be, if they're correct, and these are the professional sinologists who devote their lives to this, I have no reason to doubt them, then we don't know the ultimate aim or purpose, where this ends up. Could it end up in a completely benign international cooperation program? Of course. Could it end up in an international war of domination? Could. We just don't know. So, perspective, Australian fear. It was the former head of Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade who wrote the book called The Frightened Country. Alan Renouf wrote that book in the 70s. Guess which country he was talking about? We are a frightened country in a lot of ways. And a lot of that existential fear echoes in the back of the mind. So I completely agree that we do have to keep a sense of perspective and balance about what's going on. Let me just point out to you, though, that there are two very differing views within the Chinese community in Australia, the Chinese diaspora in Australia. And this was starkly illuminated, 2 years ago it was last year, when there was a planned series of concerts in Sydney Town Hall and Melbourne Town Hall to celebrate the life of Mao Zedong. And this was advertised as a great thing, a great event. Pamphlets were handed out, tickets were sold. Then another group of Chinese Australians rose up in protest and tried to get those performances halted, and said that they would picket the performances and protest and all the rest of it. And in the event, those performances scheduled for Sydney Town Hall and Melbourne Town Hall were cancelled by the organisers. Now, what that illuminated was that there were two very different views. The group that wanted to celebrate the life of Mao were the younger, newish, more thrusting and newly moneyed Chinese in Australia, who want to celebrate China's greatness, who want to keep in favour with the current authorities in Beijing and have an eye to their future prospects with the Chinese Communist Party. The others are people, Chinese who've been living in Australia. This is a huge generalisation, but this is the general categorisation that was provided by the groups on either side of this debate at the time, were people who'd mainly come to Australia before or around the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre. They came to get away from the Chinese Communist Party and didn't want to see any organisation, any celebration, anything that remotely resembled a Chinese Communist Party movement, pro-Communist Party movement among their own Mandarin-speaking people in Australia. They came here to avoid the party. The later group, who wanted to celebrate Mao, come here and want to extend the party rather than shun it. What I'm saying here is that there are two different views, both legitimate, and Australia has to decide its response to increasing Chinese power sensibly, sanely, with perspective, and to honour and respect the fact that, as Malcolm Turnbull in fact keeps telling us, there are 1 million Chinese, ethnic Chinese living in Australia. They're very good citizens in the main. 2 of his grandchildren are part Chinese, and they are very welcome, and with the shocking aberration of the White Australia policy, should always have been welcome in Australia. So we need to keep level heads, absolutely.
So, right at the other end of the scale of fearing Chinese, from what you said before, I'm rather worried about Uyghur people in Australia. Are they safe, or do we need to do anything to protect them?
Well, they're safe, they're physically safe as long as they're in Australia, but the sort of pressure they're coming under to return home or to have their relatives threatened in China puts them under terrible pressure. Psychologically, that can't be good for them. I don't know how many of them are returning under the weight of that pressure, and it would be good to know, but the Uyghur community in Australia, from what I've been able to figure out from talking to some of them, in fact I invited, there's a fellow called Mehmet Salepi who acted as Rebiya Kadeer's interpreter when she was in Australia. He's apart from being an interpreter, he's also a registered migration agent, works in Auburn. I invited him to come along tonight so that he could answer some questions and he could talk more knowledgeably about the situation than I can. But he apologised and said he was at a 2-day protest outside the Chinese embassy and couldn't make it tonight. So the Uyghur community doesn't seem to have good numbers and good information and good organisation, so we don't know the numbers returning. I wish we did.
Oh, I'm actually far more interested in the Tibetans than the Uyghurs. Nothing against the Uyghurs, but well, I do have a liking for the Tibetans. Now, you're very knowledgeable about history. That's why I yielded to temptation to try you out. I listened to Garner Ted Armstrong in 1970, and he told his listeners that the Japanese at that stage had achieved far more commercially than they ever set out to achieve militarily. And well, actually, I'm relieved that the Japanese don't own the world. Now, another matter, going to be a little bit frivolous. Now, years ago, I read that the Dalai Lama wanted to come to Australia and he wanted to meet with John Howard. Well, I am not surprised that John Howard did not meet with him, but I'm just wondering, did the Dalai Lama actually get a visa to come to Australia? Oh, I don't know about that. I looked for him, I couldn't find him anywhere, but I know the Pope got here. Well, I was going to say, I wonder why people call John Howard the Coward, but...
Well, on your first point, I remember a line from old Harry Lee, the founder of modern Singapore, who said when there was a lot of complaint, as you well know, in the 80s about Japanese commercial success and Japanese investment abroad and apparent easy domination wherever they went. And Lee said, the Japanese are better warriors than they are merchants. You should just be relieved that they're concentrating all their efforts on commerce, not on warfare. And of course, the Japanese, the sort of pacification of the Japanese warrior state has been spectacularly successful and endured longer than many people thought it would. On your second point about the Dalai Lama, he's been here quite a few times in recent years. I think he was here most recently just last year. Yeah, that's right. And he's been here I've interviewed him here a couple of times in the last 6-7 years. So he does come. The Australian government does give him visas. The Chinese always complain about it, but he does come regardless. Successive Australian Prime Ministers won't meet him though. Howard didn't, and Rudd didn't. I'm not sure whether Gillard was given. I don't know if it coincided. I'm not sure whether. I just can't remember whether she met him or whether she was asked or not. But no prime minister in the last decade or decade and a half has met him. But he doesn't have any trouble getting visas, just as Rebiya Kadeer doesn't have any trouble getting visas. Official recognition by government is a different matter altogether. But if I may say on your very first comment when you took the microphone that you're more interested and sympathetic to the Tibetans than you are to the Uyghurs, can I suggest to you that this is one part, that they're each a part of the same whole. The Chinese constitution promises to respect minority rights. It seems to me that that's not actually carried out in practice, just as the Chinese constitution promises the democratic rights of its people, they're not really respected. And I don't just mean electoral democracy either. If you look at freedom of speech, freedom of association, any of the rights that we would associate with democracy, which the Chinese will define differently. Can I just suggest to you that we are forced to ask, because of Chinese Communist Party behaviour, about the larger nature of the state, the larger nature of the way it uses power at home, in its adjoining provinces, like the ones we've just been discussing, Tibet and Xinjiang, how it treats its neighbours, how it treats its international commitments, whether it's the basic law that it negotiated with Hong Kong, whether it's Xi Jinping's promise in 2016 not to militarise the Spratly Islands. We have a troubling, and I'm not suggesting that China is a uniquely ambitious state. It's unfortunately very common in world history and in the world today to see states with ambitions and ruthless use of power. But the sheer scale, success and intrusiveness of China in the world at the moment forces us to ask the question, what does this tell us about the nature of the Chinese state? What does this tell us about what we need to be doing in response?
Question, I think, Geoffrey.
Thank you for the talk, Peter. Gave me a lot of thought. I'm from the Philippines, and Philippines has experienced encroachment by the Chinese. And what disturbs me is the way the Chinese have oppressed the Uyghurs. I fear for the Bajau people, the seafaring people of the Bajau they're people without a country, oftentimes undocumented, even in Southeast Asia. And what I feel is the world community has not given enough attention to people like the Uyghur, the Bajau, who are slowly being encroached and marginalized by a growing world power, with whom the rest of the world would rather make a deal with. So, how do we go beyond economics, start returning to it, our concern for the rights of the minority?
You're asking for a revolution in the way that power operates, that governments think, that companies and investors pressure governments. You're asking for a revolution in the nature of governments and societies. If everybody respected the rights of minorities, we'd be doing a lot better with our indigenous people. We'd be doing a lot better. Every country would be doing a lot better with its various oppressed minorities. Unfortunately, we're not. Unfortunately, the Chinese aren't. So I have no panacea. I have no solution. At what point do countries realise that, to quote, was it Lenin or Marx? I think it was Lenin who said the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we hang them. That we are prioritising commercial deals at the expense of human rights, our own, other countries, and the last thought I'd offer is that is over the nature of the different systems of government. I mean, so the Chinese, the reason we're talking about China tonight, and the reason that everybody around the world is talking about China tonight, is because the simple size and scale of what it's achieved and the way it's pushing its money and its influence out into the wider world. But we are also talking about the Chinese because of exactly the question that I was mentioning earlier. What is the purpose and point, and where does this end up? What is the grand strategy? What is the end point of all of this activity, investment, and striving? When Xi Jinping says strive to achieve, he didn't say achieve what? He did say the Chinese dream, and he did say we want to build a community of common destiny. It's just that we know that common destiny isn't going to be written in Canberra or Bangkok. It's not going to be written in Manila. It's not going to be written in Washington or Tokyo. It's not going to be written in Jakarta. It's going to be written in Beijing, in a closed room with a small number of people over whom there's no recourse, except for factional warfare internally within the Chinese Communist Party. So the second reason we're talking about China is because of that fact, that there is no recourse and that there is no check or balance in that system. And if I can quote the thought, on the nature of democracy, everybody always gets back to the Winston Churchill quote, democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others that have ever been tried, which is nice. But I prefer the one from Karl Popper, the Anglo-Austrian philosopher, who said, and this isn't an exact quote, this is my best memory of it, is that the virtue of democracy is not that it provides the best government, but that it provides a bloodless way of removing a bad one. And that's the second reason we're talking about China tonight. There is no recourse.
I'm just thinking a military retaliation for things we imagine China's doing doesn't seem to be very much on. Even America doesn't seem to have the stomach for anything like that. Of course, with mutually...
Trade war instead.
Yeah, but I'm thinking, what about humour as a weapon? I mean, I'm sure dictators have put themselves in power for 55 years. They have a terrible fear of someone saying, well, you're doing very well. It's a pity you weren't living in 560. But there's a lot happened since then, and most countries have decided it's better to gradually change the government. And you can look at the gross national product in most Western government countries and compare them with communist dictatorships through the years, and you'll find people are so much better off with the so-called democratic system. But why can't we modify laughter about their ancient position, even though it's winning in some ways?
Can you speak in part about, we've heard quite a bit about the geopolitical situation, especially with regard to the Islamic influence. Are there resources in that area that the Chinese are after? And is there any semblance of a sign that Western companies might be lining up to take advantage of those resources, as, say, Rio Tinto has in Mongolia?
It's an excellent question for which, unfortunately, I have no answer. I just don't know. So I'm not any use to you on that one. I'm sorry.
Do you have an answer?
Yeah, do you have an
Yes.
answer?
Sorry?
Do you know?
Do you have an answer?
We know what they're doing.
We suspect. Okay, thank you folks. That was great tonight.